for episode 3 of season 6. I keep losing track of Nautical Nights. This evening, we have a presentation by Duncan McDowall on HMCS Thiepval. All right, I forgot it right. I've been pronouncing it correctly all along. Apparently, Little Kingston ship that could. Before I get started in introductions, I do want a little bit of housekeeping first. So as most of you probably know, we do live stream this presentation as well. And so if anyone who is joining us via live stream, please feel free to engage with us via the chat function, share where you're joining us from, feel free to submit any questions, comments, observations. And if that's not working for you, you're more than welcome to send us any questions or comments via email to marmus@marmuseum.ca. That email address will be put into the chat, but it's marmus@marmuseum.ca. So for those of you who don't know, this speaker series, Nautical Nights, has been in partnership with the Kingston Yacht Club. And so we're very grateful for the Kingston Yacht Club to help us host this and run this event over the last several years. And we, of course, are now located just down the waterway, so not very far away, but we're very grateful to be able to come together for this event series and to enjoy this beautiful space. The waterways and land located within the Great Lakes catchment area have a long history predating the establishment of European settlements. The waterways in particular are to be acknowledged as the traditional trade routes of Indigenous peoples, together providing a network of trade and travel routes essential to communities since time immemorial. The Great Lakes Museum acknowledges the site it sits on and the water it interacts with to be the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Six Nations Iroquois Confederacy and the Huron-Wendat peoples. We thank these nations for their care and stewardship of this land and water, and we are committed to sharing this stewardship moving forward. A lot's been happening at the museum. As you probably know, anyone who's walked by recently knows there's a really big ship out front. It's coming along, and we do have high hopes to be open in May for the start of the tourism season in Kingston. If you're interested in getting involved with the visitor experience, maybe as a tour guide or a docent, I highly encourage you to speak with Dan Rose, who's at the front here, or myself after the presentation. We'd love to speak with you. So without further ado, let me introduce our speaker for this evening. Dr. Duncan McDowall is Emeritus University Historian at Queen's University. He is the author of many books and articles on the history of Canada, Brazil, and Bermuda. Winner of the National Business Book Award and chief investigator of Canada's Nazi Gold Inquiry, his books have been translated into French and Portuguese. His most recent book, John Lyman's The Old Bermudas, A Study of Bermuda's Vernacular Architecture, was published last May by the National Museum of Bermuda Press. His article, Sir John A. Swings on the Pendulum of History, was published in the summer 2023 issue of the Queen's Quarterly. We're going to have to go look that one up because that seems like a pretty interesting article. So without further ado, I'd like to join me in welcoming Duncan McDowall to the podium. I'm gonna switch over. This is where, yeah, okay. More tools. Okay, we're gonna get there.
Enjoy your club sandwich is what we win.
There we are. I can do it. Perfect.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you, Duncan.
Thank you. I'll take my notes.
Right, of course.
Thank you, Michelle, for the introduction. Thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you all out in Zoom land or YouTube land for coming here. I'm particularly thrilled to be here tonight because this wonderful new ship, the Keewatin, is just down the way. I think it's the most marvelous and magnetic addition to the Kingston waterfront. So congratulations to the museum. And we as Kingstonians can look forward to it as a real fixture in our touristic and heritage life. I'm doubly happy about this because the ship I want to talk about tonight was also built within meters of where we stand today, very much where the museum is. So let me begin. I thought I might frame our discussion tonight by telling you that I'm the product of a Canadian naval family. My mother and father were both Canadian naval officers. I grew up in a family where ships, naval culture, and maritime matters was almost a daily conversation. I reflect rather jokingly now that even our vocabulary in the family reflected a sort of salty touch. We talked about doing our bit. We talked about the difference between the devil and the deep blue sea. We knew how to put our toes to the line, etc. Well, this has spilled into my life and frames the way I look at things. My father, John McDowall, was an Ottawa boy who in 1937 turned up a place in the Queen's Medical School, of all things, to join the fledgling Canadian Navy. A Navy so fledgling that it couldn't even train its own officers. So my father was shipped off across the Atlantic to the Royal Navy, where he trained as a gunnery officer in Portsmouth at HMS Excellence. While he was there, he was a midshipman. You may know from your C.S. Forester and Hornblower that midshipmen were the lowest of the low in a British naval wardroom, referred to often as snotties, not in a friendly tone either. My father was therefore a snotty in England, an expat Canadian in a sense. By the time the war came along 2 years later, he was a sub-lieutenant on a British battleship, the Ramillies, in the Iceland Gap. In 1940, he was called home because that fledgling Canadian Navy was growing by leaps and bounds and needed its officer class to fight the war. And he fought the war mainly on the Atlantic and on the Murmansk Run, protecting convoys against submarines. He was torpedoed once, and on a second occasion, his destroyer, the Saguenay, was rammed by an out-of-control merchant ship, cutting off its stern. And his first command became getting the Saguenay back into St. John's Harbor without sinking, which he succeeded in. I've never been able to pick him out in this photo, but that's what remained of the Saguenay after the stern was blown off. Now, my mother was an undergraduate student at the University of Manitoba. And in 1942, she decided to do her bit, a phrase that she loved, and joined the Canadian Naval Women's Service, the Wrens. And there's a plaque to the Wrens just down the way here, or just up the way here, commemorating their great service in the war. She was a university trained, and I think explained why she was promoted quite quickly. She became a lieutenant and retired as a lieutenant commander after the war. She was in the first draft of Wrens sent to England in 1943 and was made the paymaster, a sexist term by our standards, for the Wrens in Europe, and worked in Haymarket in London and lived through the mini blitz of 1944. So an interesting life. And she became a lifelong Anglophile. She loved things English. And this, for me, captures her time in England, and she went back many times out of affection for England. So this is my family background in matters of the sea and the Navy. And although I chose to become a university professor, the sea has never been far from my consciousness and my interests. And with that in mind, some years ago, Sandy, my wife, and I took a trip out to Canada's west coast, the very far west coast of Vancouver Island, where the Pacific Rim National Park is, a stunning place. And at the bottom of that park, at the end of Barkley Sound, that long, narrow passage out from Port Alberni, are the Broken Group Islands, part of the park, and also, oh, I'm sorry, I've skipped ahead a bit. My parents met on the Queen Mary in 1946, being repatriated to Canada, and married in 47. And 2 years later, this made my appearance on the scene possible. I'm the handsome baby in the middle. The beard came later. By this time, my father was the gunnery officer on the cruiser Ontario, and here I'm being baptized, and my name is on the bell of the Ontario, one of which is here in Kingston, the other is in the Ontario Legislature Building. So throughout the 1950s and 60s in my adolescence, my life was a Navy brat life. And here in 1957, 59, when my father helped open the St. Lawrence Canal when the Queen and the Britannia came here, I tagged along and met him in Toronto. My father in the 50s went from being a frigate captain to a base commander in Halifax in Victoria, then a destroyer captain, and ended his career as our defense attaché in Moscow. So this was my salty background and really explains much what happens. So as I was saying, some years ago, Sandy and I decided to take a trip to the West Coast. And this is the Broken Group Islands at an archipelago at the end of the Barkley Sound. And to get out into these islands and explore their beauty, we chartered a boat to take us out to explore. And midway through the day, the skipper took us in that narrow channel between the two central islands, Turret and Turtle Island, and stopped the boat in the middle of that narrow channel. And he told us a story. He said in the 1930s, in the middle of the Depression, a British minesweeper, a Royal Navy minesweeper, had gone in and hit a rock and foundered in the channel and was still there below us. He said on a clear day at low tide, 15 meters below us, you could see the wreck. He then said that some years later, the name of the channel was named after the ship that had foundered there, the Thiepval. And those of you who know your middle history, some of you who I know much more than me, will know Thiepval was one of the bloody encounters of the Battle of the Somme in 1916. So that channel to this day, between Turtle and Turret Island, is called the Thiepval Channel. And you can see in an X there where the ship sank. And you can see its position on the side of Vancouver Island. That story about a British ship sinking in the middle of the Depression was in all the tourist literature at Pacific Rim. But as a historian, I thought there's something a bit dubious about this story. Why would a small British ship be so far from home, a half globe away from home, in the middle of a depression, which was gutting defense budgets everywhere, when there was no war or hostility on? It just didn't make too much sense. Furthermore, I knew that the British naval base in Esquimalt, Victoria, had closed in 1905. So this ship would have been very far from home. Okay, when I got back to Ottawa, I went over to the Directory of History and Heritage at the Defense Department on Cherry Lane. Wonderful archive. They maintain records of all the squadrons, regiments, and ships that have ever served under the Canadian flag. And without too much trouble, I called up a file for the HMCS, Her Majesty's Canadian ship, Thiepval. It was a delight. It was a thick file, and that's what historians like finding, because it probably foretells a good story. And one of the first things I realized about this, that not only was Thiepval a Canadian ship, built in 1917, but she had been built in Kingston, not far from here by the Kingston Shipbuilding Company, which was occupying land just around where the graving dock is. So I was onto something. I thought this is a story that needs to be told and rectified in a sense. The Thiepval was one of 12 armed trawlers called the Battle Class, or initially the Victory Class. Small ships, only 360 tons, 130 feet long, British design, based on rugged North Sea trawlers, able to take good seas, lightly armed with a 12-pound gun, and equipped to sweep mines and lay gates in front of harbors. A small warship, 12 of them. What makes them significant is that they were the first deliberate purchase of ships for the Canadian Navy. Designed in Britain, but built in Canada for Canadian service. The Canadian Navy was only 7 years old in 1917. It had been created in 1910 by an act of political pragmatism by our Prime Minister, Sir Wilfrid Laurier. Very quickly, I'll just back up to tell you why that was so. In 1896, Laurier won the first substantial Liberal victory in Canadian federal politics. And he did that by uniting the Quebec wing and the Ontario wing of the Liberal Party, which hitherto had been very jaded in their respect for each other. Quebec emphasizing the autonomy of Quebec in North America, and Ontario wing seeing itself still in the post-colonial period as still British. Laurier put that together and won a massive victory in the same fashion as John A. Macdonald had done with the Tories and the Bleus. But Macdonald was dead, and now Laurier had the formula. But it was a fragile formula, subject to wedge issues, as we call them now. And the first of those wedge issues that came along arrived, and here is the Thiepval, by the way. And you can see her armament, you can get a sense of her size and her ruggedness. But in 1899, Britain got into a scuffle in South Africa. Dutch-speaking Boers had fled the Cape Colony and moved inland and settled on two new breakaway states, the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. What made this important is that they sat on top of rich gold and diamond reserves that were imperially important. So Britain had to rein these two breakaway Boer colonies in. The call went out to the colonies, and the post-colonies. Come to our assistance. It's the British thing to do. In Canada, that became a wedge issue. In Quebec, Quebecers said, why should we go to the assistance of Britain? They're treating the Boers much the way we think we've been treated as a minority in North America. And we have long since cast off from France. We see ourselves as a North American nation with North American priorities. In Ontario, the call was quite different. Many Ontarians were still first-generation English immigrants here. Yes, we should go to Britain's assistance. What was Laurier to do? This was a wedge issue. I think you can see this continues today in the agony that the federal government has over the terrible situation in Gaza. Laurier came up with a sunny way solution, as our Prime Minister is always telling us. Canadians could volunteer to go to South Africa. They would be mustered here, put into uniform, and then sent across the Atlantic where they would fall under British command. So it was voluntary, and it wasn't per se an official commitment by Canada. And Canadian troops fought with valor in South Africa, at Mafeking, Bloemfontein, etc., and really was the first time our soldiers acquitted themselves well abroad. And Laurier dodged the bullet and won the 1900 election handily. But a second issue now appeared quite literally over the horizon, another wedge issue. Britain's Imperial Majesty had rested, as we all know, on the Pax Britannica, the ability of the Royal Navy to control the oceans of the world for trade, etc. But in the late 19th century, that was under threat. Germany had unified under Bismarck and was beginning to flex its muscles militarily. And at the same time, there was a revolution in naval architecture, epitomized in 1904 by the launching of the HMS Dreadnought, fear God and tread not, straight out of the Bible. What made this breakthrough naval technology so dramatic is that this was a steam turbine-driven ship, fast, armored with steel, with centerline guns, meaning the guns had a complete sweep of the targets they had, rather than firing broadside, as many of the older ships had. These ships were expensive to make and very technologically sophisticated. The call once again went out from Britain to the colonies to help. New Zealand applied. They cut a check and the HMS New Zealand was built. The Australians obliged and the HMS AS Australia was built and was said to be available to the British when they needed it. Canada was different. The same division of what was our national interest came to the fore. Laurier again had a wedge issue, and his solution was another sunny way. in 1910, he brought a bill into the House of Commons to create the Naval Service of Canada. Note the name. I mean, it sounds like a functional name, like a civil service department. The service would be put not under the Minister of Militia, but under the Minister of Marine and Fisheries. And it just happened that that minister was Louis Brodeur, a Quebec Liberal. So there was a kind of political guarantee built into it. Our Navy would not be a dreadnought Navy. It would be a Navy dedicated to protecting our coasts. In the 19th century, we had protected our fisheries with patrol boats, and the Navy was now sort of grafted onto that model. To bring it to life, we got two rather flagged out light cruisers from Britain, colorfully called the Rainbow and Niobe. And it didn't take a military genius to know one should be sent to the West Coast and the other should go to the East Coast. These were not modern ships. And around them was clustered a number of much smaller coastal ships to patrol the fishery. And remember, we just had a border dispute with the Americans in the Alaska Panhandle. So the border needed to be emphasized by Canadian ships. So the Canadian Navy was born, and an officer training school was set up in Halifax to provide some input of capable officers and sailors for it. It was passed. The Tory opposition under Sir Robert Borden was livid. This seemed to be a betrayal of Canada to its colonial past. Borden called this Navy a tin pot Navy. He understood that this equipment was pretty worn out. But the Navy began in 1910 along the lines that Laurier had developed. Laurier would lose the 1911 election, not on this issue, but on the issue of free trade with the Americans. And Borden became prime minister. But Borden didn't do much to change what he had inherited. He did petition the monarch to have the name changed to Royal Canadian Navy, but the equipment and mandate stayed the same. So that when the war came in 1914, Canada really had no effective Navy. The Niobe and Rainbow were really so decrepit that you didn't want to go too far to sea in them. And certainly you didn't want to face one of these new dreadnoughts in it. So we go to war, and any young Canadian who wanted to go to sea in World War I tended to go to England and join the Royal Navy. Our soldiers were doing far more, of course, joining up in Canadian regiments. So many thousands of young, mainly maritimers, went to join the Royal Navy. The British put some pressure on us. The war didn't turn out to be a dreadnought war. There was only one major battle at Jutland, and the rest of the time the dreadnoughts stayed in their harbors, sort of menacingly looking at each other. What changed the war was that, first of all, its length. The war came to be more and more a war of economic attrition, in which we in North America had to pump foodstuffs and munitions across the Atlantic to the trenches of Europe. What made that difficult now was that it was not the dreadnoughts that were menacing, but it was submarines. This was the submarine era. And in that sense, Laurier's mandate for the Canadian Navy made some sense. We could protect our coastlines and help these merchantmen get across the Atlantic. And one of the first ways this was done was to create convoys and guard them as they left harbor and went across the Atlantic. So the British put pressure on Canada to do something about this. It took time, mainly because we had very little shipbuilding capacity in Canada. The only example of success was here on the lakes, where Lakers and whalebacks were built to service what would have gone by our harbor in these years. But we had no ability to build heavy ocean-going ships, let alone military ships. The Keewatin, built in 1907 in Glasgow, not in Canada. So finally in 1917, after much negotiation, Canada agreed to build armed trawlers which would serve to protect this transatlantic traffic. Who would build them? The British suggested that a British company operating in Montreal, Vickers, Canadian Vickers, would be a good place. At least they'd be somewhat under the control of the British government. So Vickers got a contract to build 12 of these battle-class trawlers, which were named after Thiepval, Loos, Vimy, Ypres, etc. Vickers didn't have the ability to complete the contract, so they looked for subcontractors, and they found two in Ontario. One, the Paulson Iron Works in Toronto, which got 4 orders, and one right on our waterfront, the Kingston Shipbuilding Company, which got 2 orders. Kingston Shipbuilding Company had started in 1910 as an offshoot of the Collingwood shipbuilding industry. They liked Kingston because of the graving dock, repair work, and also because Kingston was right at the bottleneck of the St. Lawrence trade. So there would be transshipment business and more ship repair and some ship construction. So the contract was signed with the Kingston Company, and the Paulson people. They were only to build the hull and the superstructure. The fitting out, the militarization of the hull would be done down the St. Lawrence in Quebec. So in the summer of 1917, Kingston set to work to build its first warships. I'm lucky in that the Queen's Archives has all the correspondence from that period, and I could follow the construction. And it wasn't a happy experience. The lack of Canadian ability and experience in this field became apparent very quickly. First, supply chain problems. America was now at war, and the steel for building ships was coming from US Steel Corporation, which naturally put American needs first. So there was a delay in getting the steel to make the ships. There was a lack of skills. This was not a particularly sophisticated ship, but it was a modern steel ship. So you needed riveters and pipe fitters, etc., and they were in scarce supply, particularly since down in the Golden Triangle, there was a hot munitions industry paying better wages and soaking up this kind of labor. Another problem, inflation. In World War I, the government did little to control inflation, so prices kept going up, both on the material going into the ship and the labor. So there's a great deal of problems with the labor. People draining out of here and heading further west to work in better paying jobs, and then some labor unrest as the long hours and weekend hours of building this ship began to rile the working class. So it wasn't a happy experience, and the correspondence throughout the summer reflects this. The bottom line is that these ships had to be finished by the time the St. Lawrence froze. They had to be got down the St. Lawrence before winter. So finally, after much pressure, the Thiepval, the first of these ships, is launched on the 1st of September, 1917, followed shortly thereafter by the Loos in October. So it looks like Kingston's about to get its first 2 modern warships built. Then there is a problem. A late October gale blew into the harbor, so strong that it pulled the Thiepval away from her mooring and drove her across the harbor, particularly since she had no engine at this time, no workable engine. She was powerless and ended up on the rocks of the newly completed LaSalle Causeway. This was more embarrassing than anything else. There was minor damage to the plates and a bit of the forecastle of the ship, and she was towed back over here, patched up, and then finally was towed off down the St. Lawrence just as the ice was about to come through. And in the winter of 1917-18, the ships were finally equipped with working engines, guns, minesweeping equipment, etc., and radios. And in the spring of 1918, the 12 ships went to work on the east coast of Canada. Here's one of them guarding Halifax Harbor, a slightly different type of trawler, but a trawler nonetheless. One of the duties they had was to string nets and wires across the front of the harbor so that torpedoes and submarines could not get through into the harbor. They also patrolled against submarines out in the ocean, and then they also helped as the convoys formed up in Bedford Basin here in Halifax. Now, I can't tell, some of the trawlers did engage U-boats, and one actually sank a U-boat, but it was not the Thiepval. The Thiepval's time seemed to be a fairly passive one in these years. And of course, by the fall of 1918, it was all over. The war had been won. The convoys were no longer needed. What happened then was what I think is very typical of the Canadian Navy. It was immediately subject to terrible austerity. Now, the 1920s were not good times economically, and the government was cutting back. The Niobe and Rainbow were sent to the scrapyard. Another used British light cruiser was found, and many of the trawlers were paid off, decommissioned. Some became light ships, some of them became fisheries protection ships, and just a handful remained in naval service. Thiepval was one of the ones that went into the fisheries service. And there she stayed until 1923. The new Liberal Prime Minister, Mackenzie King, was much like Laurier, always looking for a middle deal to avoid the wedge issue. He was very conscious that he didn't want to be seen as a patsy of the British imperial agenda. So he shut down that naval college in Halifax, arguing that we would now have a naval reserve of fishermen who would spend Tuesday night or something getting ready for war. So the decade of the 20s and 30s for the Canadian Navy was one of quiescence. Only 2 destroyers are bought off the shelf from Britain in 1932. The rest of it rests on the remaining of these trawlers and a few other small ships. Thiepval received a reprieve in 1923 when the Navy called her back and put her back into commission, along with her sister ship, the Armentières. They realized that the West Coast was very poorly protected, so the 2 trawlers and a number of smaller ships were dispatched to Victoria. And this got the news because here were some Canadian ships taking this 8,000-mile trip through the Panama Canal up the West Coast to get into Victoria. So Thiepval is beginning to engage a kind of Canadian naval pride. She arrives in Victoria in 1923 and begins with her sister ship a series of 3-week patrols in the West Coast. They would leave Victoria, head up the coast, check the fishery out, look for American bootleggers, rescue ships in distress, and pay call in some of the more remote Indigenous reserves to sort of show the flag that they were part of Canada. The only time that Thiepval ever fired her guns in anger was in this period. She used her 3-inch gun to blow to smithereens some of the sea lion colonies on the coast, in the, I think, probably mistaken notion that the sea lions were hurting the salmon fishery. She also fired her gun a couple of times across the bow of American bootleggers, but these are not military exercises. So this became a rather routine kind of pattern for these trawlers out of Victoria. But then in 1924 came the great break in the Thiepval's history, the great dramatic change of venue. World War I had, let me just show you a couple. Here she is in Prince Rupert on one of those cruises. You can see in the foreground the coal that she needed to take on board to sustain her range. And here's that gun that they used, a formidable kind of gun, but the sea lions didn't care for it too much. In 1924, news came to Thiepval in Victoria that a special mission had been arranged for her. This reflected the fact that in World War I, aviation had become a viable source of military activity and shortly thereafter of commercial activity. We all know that in 1919, Alcock and Brown got from Newfoundland to Ireland in a Handley Page bomber, and we all know that in 1927, Lindbergh would follow from New York to Paris. At the same time, the world became fixated not with just getting across the Atlantic, but with straddling the whole Earth and circumventing it by aircraft. And in 1924, a competition was struck for a prize for the first nation that could get aircraft around the world. This was not nonstop, of course. It entailed a lot of hopscotching from one base to the next and the next. And so most of the aircraft involved in it were amphibian because a lot of places didn't have airports. Teams from Argentina, Spain, Portugal, France, America, and Britain all set out. In the end, only the Americans and the British hung in there. And one of the sponsors of this Transglobe Aviation was the Shell Oil Company, who approached the Defense Department in Ottawa and said, we will give you $8,000 if you will get a ship to pre-position fuel and supplies for the British aircraft as they come around the North Pacific. Good money, the Canadians accepted it. And in 1924, the British crew took off under Archibald Stuart McLaren here in the front, and his pilot, William Plenderleaf, wonderful British name. And their aircraft was made by Vickers, the same people who had overseen the construction of the trawlers. This is a Vickers Vulture amphibian. You can see it lands on land and can be in the water. Vickers, after World War I, realizing there was a glut of shipping, moved into aviation as well. And these aircraft sold very well in Canada because they were ideally suited to our mining frontier, where you wanted to dip into a lake and drop off some prospectors. The Air Force also bought some of them for the mail and cartographic surveys. So in June 1924, McLaren left Southampton in England and started hopscotching his way across France, the Mediterranean, the Arabian Peninsula, India, and finally down into Southeast Asia. To get ready for this, the Thiepval was sent from Victoria to Vancouver in February of 1924, where she loaded with 3,100 gallons of aviation fuel, extra parts, food, and set off north. First to Bella Bella, then to the next stop, Prince Rupert, each place dropping fuel and parts to get ready for the aircraft arrival. They also took on board, by the way, the Dominion ornithologist who was going along to look at birds, I suppose, and a photographer who took motion pictures and still pictures, as you'll see, of their journey. February in the North Pacific is not a good time to be in a small ship. The weather is vile, winter, ice can form on the ships, and notoriously big waves or swells could overwhelm a ship. So the Thiepval had to be very careful, creeping its way up the coast at only 9 knots, taking shelter behind an island when the weather turned vile. But eventually, they made their way to the tip of the Aleutian Chains, to Attu Island, which is the westernmost point in the United States, and prepared for the last jump from there over to Kamchatka and then Japan, where they would leave more equipment and eventually meet McLaren as he came around. So off they went, and there was a double challenge here. Not only this vile weather in a small ship with limited resources, coal and water on board, but of course, Russia and Japan were now very much terra incognito. Russia was no longer Russia, it was now the Soviet Union. We had no diplomatic relations with it. 5 years earlier, Canadian troops had been sent there to help the whites in Vladivostok and Murmansk. We were not popular there. When my father was defense attaché in Moscow, he visited the graveyard where some of these Canadians had died, with a big sign in Russian outside of it saying, "These are our enemies buried here." So there was a frostiness about Canada's relation and an unknownness. The same with Japan. Despite the Meiji regime and modernization of Japan, it was still a very much unknown place. Think of Puccini's wonderful 1904 opera, Madame Butterfly. And Japan is this unknown exotic culture where this terrible American naval lieutenant, Benjamin Franklin Pinkerton, goes in and does all sorts of nasty things and marries a local girl knowing he's going to abandon her. So this is the situation they face as they go across the North Pacific. They arrive in Kamchatka and encounter the Russians in Kamchatka. They don't know what to expect. A commissar from the new Soviet Union comes out to the ship and says, of course, "Who are you?" He could have seen the white ensign on the ship. And it was actually quite friendly. Captain Beach of the ship takes him to the wardroom and serves him champagne. And indicate how far this is from Moscow tells him that Lenin is dead, and it's news to him. So they're on the edge of this new Soviet empire. The commissar says, okay, you're welcome. I understand what you're here for. It's not militarily threatening. You may stay. The only condition I set, and here they are in the harbor again, the only condition I set is that you must have a Red Guard on board, a number of Red Guards to make sure you get up to no mischief. And it turns out to be quite a friendly relationship. There's no latent hostility here. In fact, here are the Canadian crew with the Red Guards, and this doesn't look revolutionary. And remember, back home, the Red Scare is on. The word Bolshevik becomes an adjective for radicalism and disruption. But as far as the Thiepval is concerned, they've made friends in Russia. Then they sail south from Kamchatka to the northern island of Japan and end up in the town of Hakodate. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, which was one of the few open ports for foreign ships to come, and American warships had visited there too. And there, the reception was also friendly, curious and friendly. And the Canadians settled in. They finally could get more coal and more fresh water for the ship. They replenished. And then they received news that McLaren had crashed his airplane in Burma, what we now call Myanmar, and that a new replacement aircraft was being sent out from Britain. So for 2 months, they cooled their heels in Japan. They again became good ambassadors for Canada. And here they are going ashore for shore leave. They're nicely dressed as sailors. As far as I can tell, they didn't behave like Pinkerton behaved. They ingratiated themselves to the Japanese and in fact introduced the local town to the game of soccer football, culminating in what we now call a friendly match between the Canadian Navy and an amateur Japanese team. They also acquired, somewhere in here. Well, I'm sorry. I had a picture here. They acquired a Japanese bear as a mascot who would eventually become a Canadian citizen. Finally, in late July, word arrived that McLaren was airborne again and working his way first to Hong Kong, and then to southern Japan, and was ready now to meet them. So the Thiepval hurriedly left Japan, having left fuel and stuff, and headed back to Kamchatka, where in late July, they finally met the British aviator when they came in. And here they are greeting him. The first thing Captain Beach did when he met the British aviators was to present them with a Canadian red ensign, hand embroidered by the life of the Governor General, Lady Byng. This was presented to them as they were now coming back into the empire. Well, now the jump from Kamchatka to Alaska, probably the hardest jump of the whole trip, faced them. Remember, there's no radar, there are no directional finders, and the North Pacific, even in the summer, has still got those swells and a lot of fog. So early in August, the two pilots take off in the Vulture, get lost in the fog, turn around and come back to the base and land in rough seas and damage one of the wings. The Thiepval crew takes the material they have aboard and helps them fix the aircraft and get it serviceable again. Then on the 4th of August, they took off and headed out and again got lost in the fog and desperately tried to find a place to land and found it on Bering Island, which sits out off Kamchatka. Landed in such rough seas that one of the wings broke off and they had to run the plane up, as you can see, onto a rocky beach where it was clearly a write-off. The Thiepval hurried there to rescue them. No one was hurt, but the plane was gone. The Thiepval then sent a message on its radio to the Times of London that the British had lost this race. It was now abandoned. By the way, the Americans, in their colorfully named aircraft, Douglas World Cruisers, finished the race in September of that year in San Diego and became the first nation to navigate the Earth in an aircraft. And here you see Thiepval with the wreckage loaded on board, heading back to Canada. with the aviators, the ornithologist on board. They arrive back in Canada as kind of heroes. They arrive, the first stop is in Prince Rupert, where they arrive at 2 a.m. in the morning. And there's a large crowd at the dock to welcome them home. Yeah, there's disappointment that the British aviators had not triumphed, but the Canadians, in one sense, were perceived as having triumphed. This little ship had gone, as it turns out in the end, 34,000 kilometers, and was showing the flag in a way that Canadians had never seen before. A few days later, they arrived in Vancouver to what can only be described as a hero's welcome. The aviators went on their way, first to Ottawa and then back to England. The Thiepval unloaded all this wreckage, keeping just one thing: the big propeller from the aircraft, a huge thing, which is signed, you can't see it here, by the aviators, which they took back to Victoria with them. And I remember when my father was base commander at Naden, being taken as a little boy for lunch in the wardroom and seeing this propeller. I had no idea what it was, and I'm not sure if my father did either. But when I saw the picture, it came right back to me that the Thiepval is still a presence in the mind of the West Coast. So Thiepval is over this, and it's written up in the national papers. She becomes a kind of hero ship, a can-do ship for Canada. But then she returns to her normal routine. And here she is getting refitted in Victoria after that arduous trip. So more of the 3-week cruises up and down the coast. And she sort of fades back into the small fleet that was the Canadian government, the Navy. Then in February of 1930, on one of these cruises, she heads north up the west coast of Vancouver Island into Barkley Sound. And that's when she goes into what is now called Thiepval Channel. The point here was that the charts they used were still 1860 Royal Navy charts. Already once she hit a rock in Bella Bella in the 1920s, and light damage, and had been repaired. But there was an ever-present danger that you didn't really know where you were going. And on that day in February 1930, she hit a rock ledge between Turtle and Turret Island, and immediately was in danger. Captain Tingley immediately ordered all the hatches shut. Water was flooding in from a sizable gash on the ship. What was saving her was that she was hung up on this ledge, and rather precariously. So he sent crews ashore in the longboat with hawsers and chains to literally tie the ship to the island to prevent her from going under. A distress call was sent to Victoria, and her sister ship, the Armentières, was sent north to come to her rescue. Through the next day, the water seeped deeper and deeper into the interior of the ship, into the engine room, depriving her of power. The Armentières arrived. No one had been hurt in this. They were all off the ship. They went on to her sister ship, and at 11 o'clock that night, she toppled off the ledge and sank into the channel. Two things followed from this. One, in Ottawa, the head of the Canadian Navy, and here's the map again, just to show you where we were. And here she is hung up on the rock. The head of the Navy base in Victoria flew in an amphibian and had these sort of pictures taken to demonstrate the peril that the ship was in. There was a commission of inquiry that absolved the commander of any negligence in this. The rock was uncharted. It is charted now, of course, but and secondly, the head of the Canadian Navy, and here she is just about to sink, Walter Hawes, who is the senior officer in the Canadian Navy in Ottawa, issued a press statement about the disaster, commending the crew for the way they handled it, but candidly in memos that I've seen in Ottawa, wrote to the other senior officers saying, well, it's unfortunate, but there's a blessing in this. It means we have one more less mouth to feed in this depression. So I'll be able to whittle the budget down a little bit, which the government is telling me to do. Rather cynical and a bit depressing. So the Thiepval is lost. First and only ship the Canadian Navy has ever lost in peacetime to sinking. A record no one wants to see broken. Since then, and she has become the site of a lot of recreational diving. After World War II, two things happened. One, we started really building our national park system, and Pacific Rim was inaugurated in 1970. And at the same time, scuba diving became a feasible recreational sport. And in the 1960s, local divers from Ucluelet pried the 12-pound gun off the Thiepval and is now in the park at Ucluelet. The divers continued. Navy divers, just 7 or 8 years ago, went to the wreck to remove any ammunition that was still on it. You didn't want tourists blowing themselves up when they were scuba diving. Then, divers from Parks Canada, knowing that the wreck was now a kind of heritage site, arrived to survey the wreck and have given us this, I think, really evocative sketch of what she looks like on the bottom, what we couldn't see from the boat. I'm told in talking to Parks Canada people that the wreck is now 100 years in and is really starting to deteriorate. But it is poignant to think that a ship that began just down the way here had such an interesting career and ends up there, so far away, but in some way connected to our national heritage. So that's the story of the Thiepval. I'd like to leave you perhaps with 2 takeaway points. The Thiepval, it seems to me, it tells us a lot about the Canadian Navy's history and what I would describe as an on-again, off-again history. We saw that despite the fact she was one of the first ships ever built for the Navy, the next 2 decades after the war were really doldrum decades, no activity, austerity. And then in 1939-40, everything springs to life again. And even Kingston comes to life again. And corvettes and minesweepers are built in the same yard by Kingston Shipbuilding. But it is all still British design. All the ships we build here are British plans sent over here for corvettes, Bangor-class minesweepers, and Tribal-class destroyers. And because it's such a steep learning curve, the costs are high and the deliveries usually late. But the Navy comes alive, and by 1945, we have the 4th largest Navy in the world. What keeps it alive, unlike the 1920s, is the Cold War. And from 45 down to about 1970, the Navy grows. In the 1950s, we spent an extraordinary 7% of GDP on defense. The Russians needed to be confronted. The Navy in that period got 3 new batches of class destroyers, an aircraft carrier, 2 more used British cruisers. So these were the kind of high noon of the Canadian Navy. But then in 1970, we seemed to lose our enthusiasm for that sort of thing. And the Navy has since then been in a rather episodic, high-cost sort of pattern of acquiring ships, leaving us in the situation we're in today, where we, because we have not ordered and built up a continuing expertise in building warships, we continue to have to turn to foreign design of ships and foreign technology to build ships. Meanwhile, our shipbuilding capacity has fallen away. We no longer even build Lakers in Collingwood. The Kingston Shipbuilding Company folded in 1968, Collingwood 2 decades after. Our Lakers are now built in Poland, Korea, and China. China now produces 50% of world shipping every year. The Chinese Navy is now the largest Navy in the world. It has surpassed the American Navy just this year. And we in Canada are left to build practically nothing. The 2 new ferries about to service us were built in Romania. The Canadian yards left are given orders, thanks to our federal provincial system. Some go to the West Coast, some go to the East Coast, etc., and struggle to provide ships for the Navy when money is made available. The almost unbroken record is cost overruns and late delivery. The 2 new Navy supply ships, which are being built in Vancouver by Seaspan, are to a German design, are now twice the cost they were estimated, and only one of them is near completion. The 2 will cost at present $4 billion. The new oceanographic ship for the Coast Guard to replace the famous Hudson was approved in 2017 with an estimated cost of $109 million. It is still not operational, and the budget is now at $1.28 billion. Extraordinary overruns. The point of this is to suggest that a nation, I'm being political here, I know, that only spends 1.4% of its GDP on defense is unlikely to have a significant navy, and in the wake of that, a significant shipbuilding industry. NATO prescribes, as we see quite often in the press these days, at 2% of GDP. And perhaps Canadian attitudes are shifting on this. The news every night reminds us what a carnivorous world we live in. But right now, our Navy is in not good shape. They don't have enough seamen, for instance, to put on, and sea women to put on the ships. And the next batch of ships that are mooted are, again, a British design, the Type 26 frigate, which is, I think, off the back of an envelope being estimated to cost $26 billion. I wouldn't trust that figure for a moment. So I think we have a major challenge here. And the little Thiepval was the very first indication of what our naval tradition might be. Now, I don't want to leave you on a negative note, because some of our ships, some of our frigates are deployed as we speak off the coast of Korea, enforcing UN sanctions against North Korea, in the Gulf and in the Arabian and Indian Sea against enforcing sanctions against Iran. Other of our ships are in drug interdiction in the Caribbean, and on other occasions have delivered humanitarian aid to places like Haiti. And that, I think, is a noble tradition. Quite literally, that follows in the wake of the Thiepval, the little ship that could, from Kingston. So thank you very much. I'd be happy to take any questions. If anyone... Yes, please.
How deep does she lays in?
About 15 meters, depending on the tide, of course. We were told you could see it on a calm, clear day. We didn't, but I don't think that's a very challenging dive for most scuba people, and they're out there a lot now. It's a very, very popular. The whole of the Broken Group is a very popular dive site. You may be wondering why midshipmen were called snotties. If you became an officer in the Royal Navy, you were not only an officer, but you were an officer and a gentleman. One of the things they tried to cure the raw recruits, the midshipmen from, was cleaning their nose with their cuff. So if you look at my father's uniform, there were 3 brass studs on the cuff of it. It's said to prevent them from doing this. The British Navy is, and to some degree, our Navy is full of these sort of Royal Navy traditions that sustain it. My father eventually quit the Navy in 1916, well, retired, he didn't, but he took his retirement when he came his way, because he didn't like what Hellyer was doing with integration, because in the Navy wardroom, this was the end of everything that meant anything to them. I think in some ways Hellyer was right in this. We had to break that British link. But my father was very much a British officer in the Canadian Navy. He, perhaps going back to his snotty training, always had a white handkerchief in his cuff here. His uniforms, dark navy, were sacrosanct. We only could have black dogs so that they didn't show up in his thing. As his son, I look back very fondly on this, but now as a historian, I see why we have had to change in this country, and why I think we have to change again in terms of our defense strategy. So, Duncan.
If we have to get real and defend our northern coast, where are we going to get the ships?
The question is, if we are going to face challenges, especially now that we are a 3-ocean nation with a melting north, where are we going to defend it with? Well, the government is building 6 new Arctic patrol ships, the Harry DeWolf class, and 1 or 2 of them will go to the Coast Guard. What amazes me is they only have a light ice-breaking capacity and only 1 very small gun on them. Now, yeah, they can show the flag, but it's not menacing in any way if what we're told Russian or Chinese submarines may want to come through. So right now we have not much capacity at all. The Harper government said that they were going to build forward bases in the north where ships could and aircraft could deploy. That has hardly got literally taken off the ground. The Russians, we got the New York Times, the Russians have recently profiled, been building these cloistered military towns in the north, well armed, and we just can't respond to that at all. There's a real naivete in my mind about how we see our place in the world these days.
Duncan, Warren, yeah, I don't know if you read the Ottawa Citizen the last day or so, but Harry DeWolf is leaking. The Harry DeWolf patrol classes has a design flaw, I gather, and is leaking. This is what you get when you go to a shipyard and say, you haven't built a warship or any ship of this ilk for decades. Now get in the business of doing it. So of course they have to hire people. Much the same problems as the Thiepval had in World War I. So of course there's some flaws get into it. The cost goes straight up. I didn't know that. It's a pity. My father was quite a good friend of Harry DeWolf's, another one of those British officers. Another question. Do you think we should try to build a shipbuilding industry, or should we be buying offshore at much less cost and a much quicker turnaround?
I think the latter. Should we rebuild our own shipbuilding industry or buy off the shelf? I think it's too late to build this up when you have countries with much cheaper labor, such as China or even Poland. The model here might be the Americans. Now, I'm not advocating that we spend money the way the Americans do on defense, but the Americans build most of their destroyers in Maine at the Bath Iron Works, and it runs like a Ford factory. These things come out, and it's continuous production, just as General Dynamics does for their submarines. So it may be cumulatively expensive, but each unit is much cheaper, and they know what they're doing, and we don't. We bought submarines used submarines from the British 10, 15 years ago that have never worked properly, partially because we really got out of the submarine tradition. I hate saying these things because the people in our Navy, the men and women, are really dedicated. They're real professionals, just that we aren't equipping them with viable tools. And the days of Lester Pearson coming to our rescue are long gone. And Mr. Trump, however ignorant we think him, is onto something by saying, if you don't pay your fees in NATO, then we're not going to be there for you. It's a terrible thing to say, but there's an element of truth in it.
What happened to the rest of the battle class trawlers? Still existing?
What happened to the other 11 ships? They're all gone now. Some of them were turned into light ships, off harbors with a lighthouse on them. Others a couple of them survived to World War II and played the same role in Halifax Harbor of guarding the entrance, but were then all scrapped right after the war. So none of them are around now. The only ship that might in some ways you might find evocative, if you've been to Halifax and seen the Sackville, which is a corvette, you can go on board her and you get some sense of what it was like to be on a small warship. I mean, these are small ships. The corvettes were said to would roll in a heavy dew. They were, but she's worth a visit if you want to get the feel of these ships. But
show a picture of that.
That's in, Pacific Rim runs up and down the west coast. Tofino is up at the top. Ucluelet's right at the bottom, and that's the park there.
Tofino's a trendy place where you can get nice Italian food, and Ucluelet is more a kind of fish and chips place. But that's where the gun is. Yes. Yes. I don't know expert, but what I read is that, of course, the Ukrainian war is changing many of the thoughts about warfare, and drones in particular. The Ukrainians have shown a particular genius, not only in the air but on boats, which is forcing military strategists to really rethink things. Do we now need men and women in uniform at the front line when a drone can really be very effective much more cheaply with no loss of human life? So I gather we're buying the first ones in Canada, but we'd be, well, in that sense, we may be privileged and be able to jump a couple of generations of these things.
Would give our ships better range.
Oh, yes. And one of the problems now with all fleets are these hypersonic missiles. The Americans invest heavily in aircraft carriers, which are very powerful images. You know, you park it off the coast and people think twice about doing anything. But if it gets a more heated exchange, these hypersonic missiles can be fired at great speed and from great distance and be very devastating. So the American Navy is now pushing its fleets further out into the Pacific to get away from these things. And we can see even with the Houthi, who are a pretty ragtag army, are scoring hits with rockets from in the Arabian Gulf. So warfare is changing, I think. And that's the problem with Canada. We end up planning and buying ships that arrive a decade after the perceived threat has moved on. So we have to re-equip them with stuff. It's expensive and frustrating.
Does Canada recover any other artifacts?
No, I think part of the rubric is that you leave the wreck as it is. And remember when they found the Franklin ships up north, there was a special negotiation with the British whether they could remove the bell and a few things. No, well, in this case, it's not a grave site, but there's a sense that you respect the integrity of the wreck and leave it for people. And if they took something, you can be sure that more local people would be out there. They already took the gun, but that was before this mandate was in place. That I know of. That I know of. That's not too reliable. Okay, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very, very much, Duncan. That was a wonderful presentation. It certainly had me thinking about a lot of different connections. One of which that I'm not sure that was made crystal clear or not, but the Kingston Shipbuilding Company is where the Marine Museum is, or the Great Lakes Museum. I gotta get that straight at some point. So that is actually the location. The ships were built at the site where the museum occupies now, slightly on the West Pier that we don't own, but it's all part of that original National Historic Site. And the concept you're talking about, how we weren't necessarily equipped at that site during the World War I to ramp up production, is one of the reasons why we have the middle section of our building. It was built during the First World War in order to serve as a workshop for steam compressors and riveting. So there's an interaction there. Please come by and see it. The other plug that I wanted to make was talking about the Naval Reserve and the whole story there that started in 1923 and continues to this day. And so we have, for anyone who doesn't know, an exhibit on at the moment featuring the works of Grant McDonald, but it's all centered around the Naval Reserve of the Second World War when he was active in the Naval Reserve as well, but features a number of his drawings and a couple of artifacts, including an artifact from one of the corvettes that was built in Kingston, HMCS Trentonian. It's the porthole that was removed, unfortunately, from that shipwreck, which was in the English Channel. a number of connections that we're looping back in with Thiepval, but thank you very, very much. Oh, one last plug was Canadian Vickers, which is, we have that collection in our collection as well. So a lot of connections there. Thank you very much, Duncan. Anyone have any last parting questions before we wrap up? Anyone online, Deb? All right. Thank you very much for everyone for joining us. Next up, we have our last presentation of the season is on March 20th with Scott Bertolet, who's an assistant professor at Queen's, and talking about Haudenosaunee slavery in Louis XIV's Mediterranean galleys. So it should be a really interesting conversation, pretty heated, I'm sure. If you would like to register, you can do that this evening, or you can certainly do that online as well. Thank you, everyone, once again, and have a wonderful evening.